Okay, let's get started. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name's Gary Forster. I'm the Chief Executive at Publish What You Fund, and welcome to this, the launch of the findings from Workstream 3 of the DFI Transparency Initiative. So today we're going to be talking about transparency of ESG and accountability to communities. Let me start off with a couple of housekeeping items. Firstly, just to say I'm joined by a number of colleagues from Publish What You Fund, including Farzana Ahmed, who is managing this project, Paul James, who leads the research, Ryan Anderton, who supports the research, and Sally Paxton, who is our US representative. I should also say we are recording this webinar from the start, and we'll be posting the resulting video on our website. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to put them in the chat and we'll try and pick them up at the end. If you'd like to speak, please say so in the chat and we'll try and give you a chance. We also welcome questions and feedback by email afterwards. I'm going to be speaking for about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll move on to questions and answers. So today, I'm going to talk you through, just give you a quick introduction to the DFI Transparency Initiative for those of you who aren't familiar with the project. Then we're going to talk about the methodology we used for this work stream of research. This has taken us about 4 or 5 months to complete, so I'll talk you through that. Then section 3, we'll talk about the findings. Section 4, we'll explain a little bit about what those findings are actually telling us about DFI transparency on ESG and community accountability to communities. And then we'll talk about next steps for the project, and then we can have the Q&A. So the DFI Transparency Initiative. So this is a 2.5-year project looking at the use of public money by development finance institutions to meet global development goals. Our objective is to work collaboratively with DFIs and other stakeholders to increase the transparency of development finance institutions. And our approach is very much evidence-based, research-led, and multi-stakeholder. The program is being undertaken in 2 main phases. So we're in the research phase at the moment. This started about 12 months ago, and we'll be moving on to the advocacy phase over the summer as our recommendations become clearer, and we work with DFIs to look to implement them. A couple of notes that I will mention. So the research to date, and this includes the Workstream 1 research, the Workstream 2 research, and indeed this Workstream 3 research, does not include financial intermediary investments at this stage. We recognise that financial intermediary investments often lack the transparency that stakeholders require. We also recognise they're often a large part of DFI's portfolios. So for that reason, we are focusing the whole of the Workstream 5 on financial intermediary investments, so we will be getting around to them. But I just wanted to say this is this research doesn't include transparency around financial intermediary investments. And then a second point, you will see from the research that we've put in the report, as well as what we're presenting today, that we have anonymized the results, so you can't tell which DFIs are which. We've split them by bilateral and then multilateral, sovereign and non-sovereign. We've done that really to highlight what we see as the opportunity for sector-wide reform for the whole development finance sector, rather than individual institutional reform of individual agencies at the moment. In terms of the timeline of the project, it started in late 2019 with us building the team and working out what we were going to be focusing on. We then undertook research from the start of 2020. And the research is split into 5 work streams. So we're now approaching the end of Workstream 3, hence us launching the report today. The transparency recommendations that will be coming out of all this work will be in around September time this year. One thing we did at the start of the project was establish a project advisory board. So these are individuals who bring a certain amount of experience, both executive and technical experience, from the DFI space and a range of different perspectives. Their role is very much to keep us on track, advise us on which areas specifically we should be looking into. We check in with them about every quarter. I won't go through the names. You can see the list there, and all of this information is on our website. But I just wanted to make those of you who are new to the project aware that the Project Advisory Board has that role. In terms of the work streams for the project, we have 5 work streams. So work stream 1 was on basic project information, 2 on impact management, objectives, theories of change and impact. Work stream 3 we're discussing today. Work stream 4 is just starting in the background, and it's focusing on the value of the investment. So that includes concessionality, mobilization, and the structure of the deal. And work stream 5 is focusing on financial intermediaries, offshore financial centers, and beneficial ownership. So you'll be able to find the reports and the webinars for work streams 1 and 2 on our website. So in terms of how we went about the research for this work stream, the first thing we do is we establish an expert working group. Now, we've had one of these for each of the work streams so far. So this is a range of experts who come together with a technical understanding on a specific issue that we're discussing. We bring them together at the start of the work stream to help advise us on how we should look at conducting the landscape analysis, what kind of priority pieces of information do stakeholders want. And then at the end of each work stream, we bring the expert working group back together and we share the draft report and the draft landscape analysis, and then discuss the implications of that, check we haven't missed anything, and so on. I will say, just for the record, that these individuals, their presence on the expert working group doesn't necessarily mean an endorsement of the findings of the research. We're an independent organization, and and as are those represented here, but we're very grateful for their participation and the expertise they offer as we undertake the research. So after establishing the expert working group, we have to figure out how we're going to contextualize the issue. So here we were very much looking at the transparency of ESG risks and the plans that DFI has put in place to minimize or mitigate them. We assess the transparency specifically of environmental and social policies, disclosure practices, and independent accountability mechanisms. I'll say now that we don't make a value judgment as Publish What You Fund, as the DFI Transparency Initiative, on the quality of these aspects. We're very much looking at what is disclosed and what is not, what is put out into the public realm. So in terms of how the research was focused, we focused on 3 research questions. How transparent are DFI policies regarding ESG, safeguarding and accountability? How and to what extent do DFIs disclose E&S risks, management and mitigation of their activities? And how and to what extent do DFIs disclose the presence, findings and recommendations of independent accountability mechanisms? So our approach for this work stream, first of all, having established the expert working group, we conducted a CSO consultation to construct the framework for the landscape analysis. And we did that partly because, we fully recognize the limitations of this being a global research program. We fully recognize the limitations that we have in undertaking sort of meaningful research at the grassroots in the communities where these DFI projects are undertaken. So we wanted to reach out to organizations that work with those communities and just get a sense that we were heading in the right direction as we were establishing and building this framework of how we were going to analyze transparency around ESG and accountability to communities. So we undertook that. We then undertook a series of interviews with DFI employees, CSOs, private sector stakeholders, and other experts. So not just those that you see on the expert working group, but beyond that list as well. And as I say, we mentioned we had 2 meetings of the expert working group. And then we commenced with the landscape analysis, which we conducted by surveying available materials on selected DFI websites at both the policy and the project levels. So in terms of how we split up the research, on the left here, we've got the kind of global level analysis. So here we looked at E&S disclosure policies, and we looked at E&S project level disclosure as well at that kind of global level, what was available via DFI websites. We then looked at the community level. So we looked at policies around community level disclosure. So what are DFI saying that they need to be doing at the community level? And then we also looked here at assurance of community disclosure. So what evidence was being provided that disclosure had taken place at the community level. And then we went on to look at IAM, so independent accountability mechanisms. We looked at the global IAM disclosure, project level IAM disclosure, community level IAM disclosure, and then again this issue of assurance of community level IAM disclosure. So was evidence being provided that at the community level disclosure of the presence and functioning of IAMs had been made available to communities. In terms of the DFIs that we've reviewed, it's the same list as for the previous work streams. I won't go through them all, but just to say that we looked at bilateral and multilateral DFIs, sovereign and non-sovereign portfolios. So in terms of the findings, oh, sorry, I'm just going to come back here. So naturally, this project, we've had a whole team of people working in lots of detail, scouring publicly available information about DFI's policies and their individual investments, their practices around ESG and accountability to communities. So there is a huge amount of detail within the report. I recommend you go and take a look for specific areas that you're interested in. I apologize if the slides that I'm about to go through are a little overwhelming. Hopefully I can talk you through them. You're not supposed to read every single thing on every page. It is all there in the report. Let's see how we get on. So the first chart here is really looking at ENS global disclosure policies. And again, just to say, we're not making a judgment here on the quality of policy content. We're just trying to identify what's available and what's not. For ENS global disclosure policies, we included questions such as, does the DFI have a publicly disclosed transparency access to information or disclosure policy? Does the DFI clearly define and articulate the number of days between project disclosure and board approval for each risk category? Do they disclose what ENS policies or standards it applies for its investments? And does the DFI have a policy on translation of project documents in appropriate languages? So there's some examples of the kind of things we were looking into. Without going into the individual detail of each question and so on, you can broadly, which we'll cover in the findings, you can broadly see that multilateral development banks performed somewhat better than bilaterals when we were looking at the global disclosure of ENS at the policy level. Moving on to ENS community disclosure policy, so policies on what DFIs should be disclosing at the community level. We ask questions such as, does the DFI clearly define and articulate what ENS documentation will be disclosed to communities for investment in each risk category? Does the DFI have a community disclosure policy? And does the DFI have a community translation policy? And again, I think we were a bit surprised to see the lack of transparency around that first question in terms of kind of, is it clear what the DFI is supposed to provide in terms of information to the community? I think we were also, it was also noteworthy that the bilaterals are lagging behind the multilaterals, again, when it comes to that community level disclosure policy, or at least transparency around that. Global ENS disclosure of Cat A and Cat B projects. So we ended up splitting the results between Category A and Category B projects, or higher risk and lower risk projects, following a challenge from a number of DFIs that actually their disclosure around Category A projects was much better than Category B. So we did a whole bunch of work to check that. Didn't necessarily find a huge difference in levels of disclosure, but there were some noteworthy findings. For global ENS disclosure, we included questions such as, does the DFI disclose the ENS assessments and plans? Do they disclose stakeholder engagement plans? Does the DFI provide a DFI team lead contact or a client contact? And what you'll see here is actually a lot of orange boxes. So this orange boxes signify instances where in some instances we were able to find disclosure, but in some instances we weren't. So there's clearly inconsistency there. There's clearly questions about how consistently DFIs are actually sort of following their own policies in that instance. On to assurance of community ENS disclosure for Cat A and Cat B projects. So again, so this point on assurance came up time and time again. It was something that was valued by a variety of stakeholders. So there was, it was explained to us that it was of significant value to understand how DFIs had provided, sorry, or whether they had provided evidence that they had disclosed information to the communities, and if so, how. So for this part of the work, we included questions such as, does the DFI state the date of community ENS disclosure? Does the DFI state the place of community ENS disclosure, and the method as well? And while we found little evidence of assurance of community ENS disclosure, we did note some instances whereby DFIs were able to state the place and date of community disclosure, as signified by those oranges and a couple of those green boxes on the charts there. Moving on to IAMs, and looking at the global level. So we ask questions such as, does the DFI disclose the availability of IAMs on their website? Is the IAMs mechanism highly visible on the website of the DFI? Does the DFI disclose IAMs results, responses, or findings? So, you know, we found that the disclosure of the presence of IAMs on DFI websites was generally good. However, we identified very low levels of IAMs disclosure at the project level. And if we dig into that a little bit further on the next slide, this is the last of the findings slides. This one's looking at whether the DFI provides assurance of IAMs community disclosure for both Cat A and Cat P projects. So at the community level, is the DFI providing evidence? Sorry, is the DFI providing evidence of having undertaken community disclosure around IAMs at the community level? And what we recognize here was that the requirement of the client to disclose the presence of an IAM is lacking. Where we identified that this requirement is present, it is in new policies which are yet to be operationalized, and this is, we think this is quite important, that actually not requiring clients to disclose the presence of an IAM could definitely undermine the transparency of the existence even of an IAM. The first columns on this chart highlight that the client is rarely obligated to inform communities themselves of the presence of an IAM, and the second column relates to the DFI making the community or having an obligation to make the community aware themselves. And as you can see from the columns further to the right, we were very well, only in one instance really were we able to find any assurance that communities have been informed about presence or the availability or the functionality of an IAM. So, okay, so that's all of the detail. That's what we found when kind of going through line by line, DFI by DFI against all of these areas. So what does the research tell us? At the global level, and this is quite an important point, but at the global level, so we identified systematic disclosure from at least one DFI for every aspect of global disclosure that we looked at, suggesting that global disclosure can be undertaken by all DFIs. We found that most DFIs have transparent and fairly sophisticated policies that govern the application of ESG safeguards. So at the policy level, that's what we found. We found that disclosure of ESG risks is mixed. Disclosure is higher for multilaterals than for bilaterals, and generally more extensive for category A projects than for category B projects, but it was rarely systematic. We found instances of disclosure not taking place even with category A projects, which suggests that DFIs are not adhering to their own policies. And then finally, global disclosure of the presence of IAMs was high. As exhibited, we found that information on websites and on most project pages. But as we move from the global to the community level, our research identified a significant gap between global policy and local implementation. So there is limited assurance of community disclosure. And I think you can see from the data we've just been through that it's very, very limited assurance of community disclosure. In some cases, DFIs provided information on the date, place, and method of community disclosure, but this was not normally done in a systematic manner. DFIs do not directly communicate to affected communities that options for recourse such as IAMs are available to them, nor do they typically require their clients to disclose their existence to affected communities. And And being transparent with respect to ESG and accountability is in the interest of DFIs. Research looked at all sorts of areas, and one thing we identified was that complaints related to information disclosure feature commonly in IAMS cases, indicating that numerous cases could have been avoided had requirements been fully met. So back to this matter of assurance, and here we're talking about assurance of community disclosure. So for those few DFIs which do provide assurance of community disclosure, it is by no means systematic. Assurance was more common for high-risk Category A projects than for medium, low-risk Category B projects. And because DFIs do not confirm that disclosure requirements for ESG and accountability measures have been met, we could not reasonably assess the extent of the gap between ESG policy requirements and their implementation. Given the role and responsibility of DFIs, we believe they should publicly verify that community disclosure has taken place, i.e. provide evidence of when, where and how it took place and what documentation was disclosed. And of course, we'd like to think that DFIs have, this is information that the DFIs should have anyway in order to meet their own internal systems and checks. So hopefully it wouldn't be too big a lift. In terms of next steps for the project, just to say we are currently concluding this work stream and we are open to feedback. Hopefully we'll receive some in a moment, but also please feel free to follow up with emails or by contacting our team. We're currently commencing work stream 4, which is on the value of the investment, and work stream 5 will be starting very soon as well on financial intermediaries, offshore financial centres and beneficial ownership. And then finally, just a reminder, our transparency recommendations will be launched in September 2021. So I'm now going to take a look at the chat and see if we've got any questions. My team can join me in helping to respond to them as well. Just give me a second to have a look. Okay, so some of these questions have come into panelists, which means that the attendees won't be able to see them. So there's a question here saying, I understand it's not a qualitative exercise, but one issue raised during the consultation was that of quality of information disclosure at the community level and how a DFI ensures it was in a non-coercive environment. The example used at that time was a community consultation meetings attended by armed soldiers or militia. Info disclosed in that context is useless. No one dares to stand up, question, or even participate. So though you have shown information disclosure at community level, this can be an important aspect to mention to assure that information disclosure is carried out in a fair and free context. I think that's an important point, and one I think we agree with. I think what we've tried to do here, well, hopefully, if we're successful in encouraging disclosure around the areas that we've mapped, what that should do is it should make it visible to stakeholders the method and the time and the date and so on that disclosure was done, which is a step in the right direction. I agree, it probably wouldn't capture such nuance as is being hinted at or is being explained there. Oh, okay, sorry, so that was shared with all attendees, so you were. And just looking at another question here, of course, DFIs can look to your results as a prompt for how they can improve their transparency and accountability, but what other players in this space stand to learn important lessons? I'm thinking private impact investment firms rank among them, but any more you can think of. So we're having a variety of discussions at the moment with both DFI executive teams, their boards, their shareholders, government authorizers, to kind of make them aware of what we're trying to do here. My sense is that, and the private sector certainly, I think, could benefit, especially for impact investors in terms of how they report, because even those who have signed up to kind of recognize standards, be it the GIN or HIPSO or IRIS Plus, I think around their disclosure, there are still ways that they could improve. But I think we see an opportunity. I think many of the DFIs we've worked with on this have seen an opportunity to much better be able to demonstrate their value and impact by being more transparent. So this isn't just a kind of bureaucratic exercise, it's a fundamental in terms of the way they communicate their role and so on. Do you think, okay, there's a good question here. Do you think that institutions have evidence of when, where, and how local communication occurs? Did you ask for it and not get it? Paul, did you want to come in?
So I think in numerous interviews with ESG teams from DFIs, there was indication that DFIs do collect this information. There were also admissions that in some cases this information isn't collected, but it was kind of portrayed as an oversight. And largely it was stated that institutions collect this information as part of a due diligence process. I guess part of our argument is that if DFIs are going to have policies which require community disclosure, then for those policies to be meaningful, they need to be verifying that their clients are carrying out community disclosure. Now, we recognize that the relationship between a DFI and its client, particularly in terms of how responsibilities are shared, is not always straightforward. Which is one of the reasons we looked for assurance, was that rather than saying, okay, DFIs should naturally be disclosing this information themselves, as a kind of minimum step, they should be making sure that their client has done it. And the kind of qualitative evidence we gathered was that this information typically is collected by a DFI, but not always disclosed to the public.
Thanks, Paul. There's a follow-on for you here, Paul. So we had a question. I'm curious if you looked at accessibility of community information disclosed. Have you, I'll read it out just in case anyone's not seeing them. I'm curious if you looked at accessibility of community information disclosed beyond translation and language, both on the policy side. So did DFIs have policies requiring disclosure in accessible formats, as well as practice and documentation of whether information was shared in alternative or accessible formats?
Okay, so on the practice side, we when we looked for assurance of what was disclosed, both and also for the global disclosure, under summary of ENS risks, I think it's called, one of the summary of ENS risks, one of the columns in our framework, we accepted non-technical summaries. So we accepted, or we were looking for more accessible forms of ENS disclosure than what are typically very dense and technical ESIAs and ENS assessments and plans. On the policy side, I think we probably could have looked more at that. That's something we didn't maybe unpack quite enough, was whether or not there was a requirement to use non-technical disclosure or more accessible disclosure.
Thanks, Paul. So there's a couple here that I can take. So there's one, will you share information on specific DFI if requested? So our plan is over the next few months, we are packaging up the results for the individual DFIs and sending them to the DFIs themselves to give them a chance to look at them and go over them. And then our intention is to make the information public at the end of the year. So meanwhile, while we are sort of working collaboratively with so many stakeholders, and we want to kind of look at this from a DFI sector perspective rather than an institution perspective, we'll keep them anonymized, but by the end of the year they will be, once we've just checked them, they will be public. And of course they're all built on this whole everything we've done is built on publicly available information. We haven't paid for access to any data or been given anything exclusively, so yeah, it is all based on that. There's a question here, will you be drafting model policies? It's a good question. I'm inclined to say maybe not, for a couple of reasons. One, our research has identified that specifically when it comes to ESG, that actually the policies seem to be there and they seem to be somewhat comprehensive. I mean, there's certainly things missing as identified by our research, but the real gap identified here is is between the policies and the implementation. So if anything, the outputs of this work might lean more towards specific kind of granular technical recommendations on specific fields we'd like to see, or disclosure we'd like to see, or standards we'd like to see around minimum disclosure expectations, so that one, it's very clear what's expected. Two, DFIs can harmonize across their disclosure, so that for those stakeholders who are looking across multiple DFIs, we get some kind of level playing field. And three, also by being that specific, it allows the executives within DFIs to really understand what we're looking for, but it also allows their stakeholders and their shareholders to monitor their progress towards implementing, if we can be that specific. So I'm not sure if any of my team wanted to add anything on that question, the question being, will you be drafting model policies?
Gary, maybe it would be helpful if we just said a little bit more about our transparency recommendations in general. You know, what we're doing now, as Gary has said, is we've been going through kind of collecting the evidence and trying to be very granular in the way that we develop this the evidence. So the big charts that you've been seeing kind of go data point by data point. Is it available? Is it partially available? Is it not available at all? So we're trying to, by going down to a very granular level, get away from kind of disclosure, these kind of high level principles, and really look at the data points that we think are important and whether or not they're disclosed. So we're not completely done with our thinking yet on what the transparency recommendations will look like, but I think we will pull out recommendations from each work stream and kind of prioritize those. We will have recommendations that would apply kind of more cross-cutting issues, such as commercial confidentiality and how that might be dealt with. We are at the same time, as we go through our research, trying to highlight innovative practices. So if we've come across a particular issue where there's a lot of claims of, say, for example, commercial confidentiality, we're looking for those DFIs that have particularly innovative practices that have found a way to both protect commercial confidentiality, but also provide the disclosure, say, for example, on development impact. And then finally, we're looking at, you know, should we provide, in addition to the kind of the written recommendations, a kind of very granular, this is the data that, you know, kind of data point by data point, this is what this means, and this is how it should be disclosed. And that way, kind of giving a roadmap to a useful tool, really, to DFIs and others as to the data points that we think ought to be disclosed. So that's our current thinking. We're still working through this. We obviously have a couple more work streams to go, but that's our current thinking. And then we'll take those recommendations and broadly disseminate them and try to work for their uptake.
Thanks, Sally. There's a question here, Paul, I might give you the second half of this. So the question is, do you have an idea why there are so many reds in your findings and why there are significant differences between multilateral and bilateral DFIs? So why are there so many reds, I think is a factor of a few issues. So one is we looked at an awful lot of stuff. So, you know, there's huge numbers of bits of information that we looked for specifically. You know, therefore there were going to be a lot of columns. Why are DFIs not sharing this information already? I think there's a variety of reasons. We recognize that there is a cost to disclosure, and whether that's time or financial or resource. There isn't really, some DFIs will argue that maybe there isn't sort of harmonization across what they should be providing. There isn't some kind of standard or some kind of obvious sort of benchmark of what they should be providing. And yeah, so I think there's a number of factors of why it's not there. And then the fundamental question is, well, to what extent is it that they have the information but they're not making it available for certain reasons? What we didn't come across, which we came across on other work streams, was sort of commercial confidentiality arguments. They didn't tend to feature so much here. Paul, I don't know if you want to add to my comments there and take the second part of that question on the difference between multilateral and bilaterals.
Of course, yeah. So in terms of why there is so much red, this is a question we've grappled with ourselves, as Gary's reflected on. And we actually started out with a slightly larger framework, and as we learned as we went on, we decided maybe some things were less pressing or less relevant. So this is actually slightly trimmed down in the first instance. I would say that the differences between multilaterals and bilaterals partly come down to the fact that multilaterals tend to use a lot of kind of secondary document disclosure alongside their basic information. So what you will often find is that for multilaterals will have, for example, ESIAs or stakeholder engagement plans, and documents which are available to download and view. This is actually really quite rare for bilaterals. Bilaterals often only have a basic project page, which might have information such as categorization and a summary of risks, but very little in terms of the ENS documentation that you'd expect to be kind of conducted on a project.
Thanks, Paul. So we've got a question here. For the advocacy phase of this study, how do you hope to influence DFIs to be more proactive in making ESG standards and IAMS information available to communities? And do you think that do you think that the opacity that is ongoing is to some extent deliberate because it is easier to implement a development project without engaging with communities? So two questions there. Maybe they're joined. We can hypothesize on whether the opacity is helping DFIs or not, but what our research has identified is that there's very little assurance being provided about whether the DFIs are actually following their own policies when it comes to disclosure. Now, you would like to think that with the effort that's put into developing these policies and the importance of them within these institutions, that the DFIs would be doing everything they can to follow their own policies. So I think what we've identified here isn't necessarily something that has to change in the way that DFIs talk about or think about or govern themselves when it comes to disclosure, but rather that they need to make sure that what is in their policies is actually what they're doing, and that a way of doing that is to provide assurance that they've done it. What we do know from talking to DFIs is it's increasingly recognized that the costs of doing community disclosure badly is becoming prohibitive for a number of reasons, and that there are, and that's a concern for boards, it's a concern for the shareholders that authorize these institutions. So it feels like there's a bit of a, and I don't want to sound naive because I recognize that we have people on this webinar who have been working on these issues for 20, 30 years. But it feels like maybe there is an opportunity to bring this back to, how do the authorizers that are funding these institutions have confidence that the policies are those that are being implemented, and transparency is a simple solution to confirming that. There's another question here. Thank you for this research and your findings. Were you able to evaluate or account for the information disclosed at various stages of the project cycle? It's been our experience that information is lacking at the early stage prior to project approval, which is arguably the most crucial window for communities to be meaningfully informed and enabled to participate and shape project design. This goes for translation of documents as well. If they are disclosed, translations are only available much later. Paul, do you want to talk about the project cycle and timeliness in general?
Sure. So I think this, we'll hold our hands up and say this is probably one area we haven't addressed in great detail in this report, is the timeliness of disclosure. One of the reasons for that was our small project sample. It was hard to draw kind of meaningful results, I think, because the patterns around timeliness, sometimes it can be kind of egregious individual examples of late disclosure, which our small sample wouldn't capture. I think the questions actually come from somebody from IAP, but I have in my notes, kind of in preparation for this question, that IAP and the early warning system have done some really important work around timeliness in the last few years. And the methodology used there, where the kind of a whole year's sample has been analysed, was something we weren't really able to replicate here. But it's something we're going to work on for the recommendations as a whole, is guidelines around timeliness. On the policy side, I would say that while we were aware that a number of DFIs have guidance about early disclosure, particularly for high-risk projects, our framework asked for more prescriptive details about what types of documents would be disclosed at each risk category. And we marked most of these red essentially because when the risk category wasn't category A, so whether that was category B or low risk projects, there's very little guidance about what will be disclosed. Indeed, even within category B, there's a lot of variation. There's often terminology such as like disclosure according to risk. And this also applied to timeliness then, but the statements on timeliness according to categorization were not clear in our mind.
Thanks, Paul. There's a question here. If you have come across good practices for community information formats, it would be great if you could share. Paul.
Yeah, we could look to do maybe produce something on this. I think I'd be hesitant to hold up one particular DFI as performing particularly well when it comes to assurance at the moment. We found documentation, and there's some in the report of where we've given examples of what assurance looks like. But as was raised in the point earlier, there's there will always be questions about the quality of assurance as well, and what quality what community disclosure looks like. So at this point, I'd be hesitant about kind of raising particular examples, but I think that is something we could look at doing going forward.
Thanks, Paul. There's a couple of questions asking about why we're not disclosing the names of the DFIs in the results. So we did mention at the beginning, we're trying to keep the focus of everybody on the opportunity for sector-wide reform. We are going to be making the information public once we've compiled the final report at the end of the summer. Yeah, we agree. There's a comment which DFIs are performing better and could be a reference point for others. We agree that that's an important opportunity to hopefully drive reform, but we will be looking to do that once we've run the data back through the DFIs to check that we're looking at the right issues, and then we make that available at the end of the year. If you when you move on to the second phase related to advocacy, will you continue to focus on sectoral reform or shift to institutional change? That's a good question. You know, I think we've worked collaboratively with a variety of DFIs throughout this project, and we know that some are already keen to be, you know, to see what the outputs of this work are, because they feel that there's a gap when it comes to sort of expectations around DFI transparency in certain areas. Now, I don't want to say whether that is a good argument or a bad one, but there are certainly some institutions that are keen to see this work and adopt what comes out of this. What we need to do is try and make sure that we don't just end up with one or two front runners, and our other work streams. So for example, our work streams on impact have highlighted that there are a couple of front runner DFIs, and what we need to do is make sure that those organizations that adopt and do better, that we can use that whatever approach we're using there to try and encourage the whole sector. I mean, it's you know, when you look at when you stand back and look at some of the results of some of these work streams, and you say to yourself, what does it really say if we don't have transparency around the impact that we're making on an investment? Or what does it say if we don't know if a DFI conducted or not any community engagement around this investment? Those are really fundamental questions, and you'd like to think that we'd get to a stage where governments wouldn't authorize recapitalizations and investments into DFIs that couldn't, you know, I don't even know if it's fair to call those minimum standards, but that couldn't evidence that they were undertaking some of these basic steps. And whether it comes in through the form of a transparency project like this or through something else, we hope that what we've done is uncover in detail the reality of what you can learn about DFI investments at the moment, where the limitations are on understanding their impact, and understanding what they do on environmental and social and governance issues.
Gary?
Yes, Sally.
Just to add to that, I think when we kind of get into our more formal advocacy phase, there are a lot of different ways that you can advocate for improvements in transparency. Some of it may be sectoral, some of it may be institutions, some of it may be looking at which particular, where in, for example, in reporting on development impact, is there, can there be progress made? What are the levers for getting there? So I think we don't have to pick one or the other. I think we can pick a number of different avenues to start to hopefully educate people, and then pick up, have people take up our recommendations. So whether you do it by leading DFIs, whether you pick a particular issue, whether you go after particular stakeholders or shareholders, I think there are lots of different ways that we can try to have our recommendations implemented. So I think at this point, a lot of this is on the table, and I think we will use a lot of different avenues.
Thanks, Sally. So there's a question here: was there any indication of which sort of DFI was open to more innovative financing or structures? So this workstream didn't really give us an indication of that. Workstream 4, which is on how DFIs structure their deals, will give us much more insight into the different mechanisms and approaches that DFIs use to make investments. So I think we'll be able to hopefully answer that in a couple of months' time. Did you find that multilateral DFI status as international organizations and relative immunity in international legal processes compared to corporations had an impact on their transparency and accountability? That is an important and a big question. I don't think we have a view on that. Paul, did you notice any patterns or anything?
No, I couldn't answer that confidently, to be honest.
Okay. Sorry, to the audience, we don't have the answer for that. A comment or a question here: maybe it would be interesting to look at budgeting. Also, how much money do DFIs set aside for production of adequate materials and their translation and communication to local communities? It continually baffles me how DFIs can spend $100 million on a project, but can only manage to produce a short summary of an EIA in the main national rather than local language, often months later. Without budget and dedicated resources, transparency is not going to happen. That is a fair challenge, and that's in that group of issues that we are aware of and constantly wrestling with. Is it a transparency thing? Should we be looking to see if DFIs state what proportion of their investment will be allocated to not only ESG, but also to transparency itself, for example? I think it's a good point, and I think it's one we'll continue to wrestle with. Okay, sorry, I'm just catching up with the questions. Complementing Kate's question, and given that it seems that a common DFI justification for lack of disclosure is the cost of it, was there a discussion of budgeting for the proper implementation of their policies? Do they have an estimation of that cost compared to the total cost of the project? Paul?
So this is a topic we've talked about on a number of our work streams, actually, is the resources dedicated to various aspects of DFI work. And it arguably applies to impact in a similar way as it, or development outcomes in a similar way as it would apply to ESG. And we are aware that different DFIs fund different aspects of their work in very different ways. We have particularly some multilaterals have been set up as kind of streamlined or lean organizations, and then you have others which are very heavily staffed and with much larger budgets. I think we don't have a full answer for how much should be spent. It's been my thinking for a while that kind of benchmarks for certain aspects would be kind of useful development in the sector as a whole, but is perhaps beyond the scope of the transparency organisation.
Yeah. which speaks to kind of the role of this work, or maybe sort of placing the role of this work. You know, we recognize, and it became apparent through the expert working groups and through all of our consultations, that there is so much that we could and arguably should be looking at when it comes to ESG and accountability to communities. But we've had to pick our battles, and because the starting point of so many DFIs is so low, you know, and I say that in terms of, we have evidence to show that there's not a lot of data, but I think also just in terms of what a layman might expect to be able to see about specific investments, that actually if we can normalize some of the things we're talking about here as being acceptable minimum sort of standards for DFIs to adhere to, then it would leave more space to talk about those other things. You know, we've been talking about format of information to be provided to communities, and we've got a sheet of red boxes that the DFIs aren't sharing with us what they've actually shared with the community, or whether they've shared anything at all. So it feels like it might be sort of walking before we can run. Look, I think we're through with all the questions there. I can't see if there's any hands up. I don't think we have that function. So I presume that's it. And I'm looking at my team. I think we can probably wrap up. And look, if you do have any views, if you look at the reports and want to let us know anything, please do get in touch with us. We have a team working on this, and we're more than happy to engage if we've missed anything or need to change anything. That is also true for the next work streams, work stream 4 and 5 that are just starting, and then we look forward to engaging with you all when the recommendations are ready towards the end of this year. So thank you very much for listening. Thank you for your patience while we went through all these questions, and take care, everybody. Thank you.